In this entry, we'll be taking a look at the Kingpin, otherwise known as Wilson Fisk, specifically from the iteration from Into the Spider-Verse. As with most incarnations of the character, the Kingpin here bears the similar traits of brutality, viciousness, and a lack of empathy. But perhaps the overarching attribute of this version of the Kingpin is that of his irresponsibility for his own actions. There isn't much backstory provided for this version of the Kingpin, but based off his present discourse, we can gather several pointers. The first of which would be the Kingpin's greed, alluded to in the moment when he tells Spider-Man it's not always about the money, implying that most of his past actions have been rooted in financial gain. Earning a decent profit is not a moral issue, but it's cause for concern if it requires aligning with criminals and engaging in criminal behavior yourself, which is the case with Fisk, who appears to have a roster of supervillains in his pocket, signaling to us that this is a man who has no qualms about resorting to nefarious means for the sake of his bank account. Judging by his current accommodation in an opulent penthouse and his status as a key figure in the city, we see that this greed has paid off, crowning Fisk as the king of his domain, both in the respectable spotlight and in the shadow of the criminal underworld. This double life, however, was one that was kept from the people most dear to him, namely his wife Vanessa and his son Richard. Whether it was out of protecting them from his criminal enterprise or preserving the innocent image that they have of him, we can only speculate. It's here that we observe that this is perhaps his one and only virtuous trait, that while he is a man consumed by greed, at the end of the day he is also a family man who genuinely cares for his loved ones. But as fate would have it, these ideals prove to be incompatible, and in a moment of tragedy, the Kingpin loses those dear to him. This loss was hugely detrimental to Fisk, showcasing his emotional dependence on his family, highlighted in the moment at the end when he pleads with the other Vanessa not to leave him. As a result of this tragedy, we find the Kingpin to be living a life of quiet desperation, one abounding in loneliness and bereavement, the anxiety of which is only quelled by his coping mechanism at hand, the incessant clicking of a ballpoint pen resembling the sound of a metronome to calm himself from boiling over. He remains a man of few words, but overall largely stoic and composed in the midst of his sorrow and depression. Other than his ending fight with Miles, the only two times we see him lose control of his emotions are when Spider-Man hits a raw nerve and mentioning the futility of his plan, leading to an uncontrolled burst of rage in the form of several thousand newtons of force channeled through his fists. The second instance was when he was so angered by the Prowler's hesitation that he decided to execute him first before dealing with Miles, which proved to be an illogical decision. Incidentally, this moment also serves to drive home the fact that the Kingpin is a man who has no tolerance for failure, and will go so far as to execute his subordinates as punishment. When we do encounter him in his debut appearance in the film, we see the Kingpin's one and only moment in which he appears to have some semblance of joy, his monotone humming of "Here Comes the Spider-Man," a stark departure from his usually somber temperament, one that is fueled by the possibility of undoing his tragedy through stealing a variant of Vanessa and Richard from another world. This casualness of the Kingpin is not only inconsistent with his character, but also with the current situation. All the scientists appear to be displaying some fear over the Collider experiment, given the risk of causing the collapse of the space-time continuum. It's more than likely that the Kingpin knows of these repercussions, but, as is often the case with him, he just doesn't care, even if all of Brooklyn could be sent into a black hole. Sure, the Kingpin has always been a ruthless criminal, one who is accustomed to taking the lives of others, so this situation shouldn't be any different. But it should matter to him, because if he were to disrupt the space-time continuum, his life would be just as much in danger with his other potential victims. This casualness is again seen in him making light of the situation to Spider-Man, when he labels the Collider as his latest toy and telling him it's going to be a hell of a light show. What's even more appalling is the fact that even if he were to bring a variant of his wife and son to his world, it's ultimately a futile effort, as eventually these variants will disintegrate if they stay too long in another dimension. Kingpin knows this by the end of the film, yet he stubbornly carries down the same path. In all this, the Kingpin's decision to steal another version of his family demonstrates two key aspects of his character: his lack of a will to live and his lack of responsibility. Regarding the first, this is perhaps hinted to us by the Kingpin's statement to Spider-Man, telling him that the Collider cost a fortune, but then, in his own words, he justifies it with the notion of, "You can't take it with you," signaling to us that the Kingpin has been preoccupied with thoughts pertaining to death and the afterlife. Again, this drives home the point of just how much his family meant to him and how emotionally dependent he was on them. With that in mind, it's no surprise that the Kingpin exhibits such casualness in the midst of such a dangerous operation. His will to live is hanging on a thread. He has nothing left to lose and is perhaps content to be put out of his misery. So whether the experiment succeeds or fails, it's a win-win situation for him. Regarding his lack of responsibility, one needs to look no further than his motive: to undo his tragedy by selfishly stealing his family from another version of himself, an act that would only spread his misery to another of his variants. Due to the possibilities offered by the multiverse, the Kingpin appears to still be in the denial stage of grief, believing that his family can be replaced. But this attempt at replacement also showcases the Kingpin's reckless nature. Even if the new Vanessa and Richard could survive, there's also the question of whether they will even be willing to stay in this universe. Not all of the Vanessa and Richard variants will be suitable for him, and at the midway point of the film, Olivia Octavius hints at this, saying that he can bring over as many variants of his family as he wants, which would put a high number of them at risk of dying. This lack of responsibility is also highlighted in his aversion of guilt. The death of his family was undoubtedly an accident, but one that might have been avoided if Vanessa wasn't reeling in shock from seeing her husband's ugly side. One of the worst feelings a person can have is to know that they had a hand in the deaths of their loved ones. Therefore, it's somewhat natural that the Kingpin seeks to repress this truth and avoid any blame out of a self-defense mechanism. If he were to admit his guilt to himself, this would completely shatter his self-image. But unfortunately, while it may be the unpleasant thing to do, owning up to the truth is eventually the necessary step to take. In the climactic fight scene, when he tells Miles, "You took my family," he shows us that he is a man who cannot bear the weight of his actions and one who will do anything to cast the blame off of himself. Miles isn't even the same Spider-Man he has been tangling with, which makes his accusation against him all the more unfounded. At the end, history tragically repeats itself, and in a case of déjà vu, the Kingpin finds himself in a mirror of the inciting incident that resulted in the death of his family. Because he has rejected all the blame, the Kingpin finds no reason to turn over a new leaf, and is therefore bound to commit the same mistakes of the past. Yet in some sense, he remains a tragic character, a man who was torn in two directions, one in the virtuous traits of his love and affection for his family, the other in his greed and his lust for power. When we get down to it, if he had known that his life of crime would one day cost him the lives of his family, there's a good chance he might have been willing to walk away. Unfortunately, he never got to make that choice, but that choice was tragically made for him.